Thank you.
Thank you very much for y'all's time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mike Olcott. How are you this evening?
Good. How are you doing?
Good, thank you.
So I wanted to first make a comment on Dr. Bone's opening statements. She's right. As I mentioned last week, our group believes very heavily in teacher salaries because we believe that's where the heart of learning is. I mean, putting more money in the classroom and teacher salaries. I didn't quite agree with her comment about she didn't throw in staff because I know maybe it's a fine point, but not to say that we don't believe in staff and giving raises to staff, but where I did not really agree with some of the budget numbers I heard in the budget workshop was, whereas a 6.5% to 7% raise for teachers is very admirable, and I think that's great. When I'm working to try to get a reduction in M&O tax rate, when you're talking about a 5% raise for staff, that seems kind of high considering the agony that a lot of taxpayers are going through right now, because many of the people that are paying the taxes for that 5% raise, none of them are getting 5% raises. You know, they're likely to get a 2 or 3% raise. And so I think in that sense, I think it'd be more along those lines. But the other thing that I also agree with Dr. Bone about was the effective tax rate is more complicated with school finance. Mr. Husfield's gone over that very carefully, and that's why we did not ask for more than a 4-cent rate, because of the complexity of the effective tax rate, and because we wanted to be able to allow sufficient room for very significant increases in teacher salaries. And so I just want to remind, I know that Mr. Husfield maybe threw some doubt on there about the unknowns. I'm going to get to that in a second, but I just want to remind the school board that you all do have the power and the option to lower the M&O tax rate. And we're asking for, in our opinion, a very modest reduction to 4 cents. In regard to the numbers, I think hopefully most of you all got the email that I sent out today. It actually got some numbers, and in that email I mentioned that I was waiting on confirmation from Mr. Husfeld on my numbers that I had researched correctly, and of the 3 questions I asked, he did confirm the 2 numbers about the M&O budget from this year and last year. The one thing he was a little bit less certain about or would not answer was what does 1 cent translate to? I calculated it roughly around 400,000. He said earlier tonight is maybe more like 375,000, but he said depending on what the TEA does, maybe it's something like that. But I think that we can deal pretty much in round numbers. The first numbers are actually very solid numbers, and that is, and this is probably the most important I'd like to make to the school board, is that the M&O revenue from last session, the one we're finishing up right now, the last budget cycle, was $51,244,237, and the proposed M&O revenue for this coming budget year is $58,434,550. That represents a $7,190,313 increase in M&O budget. That's a 14% increase in M&O revenue. 14%. The student population growth, which is what I just heard, was 5.97%. Now, that's, if I wanted to be a student, I could come in here and say, well, why not just increase it, the M&O by 6% in line with population growth? The reason I'm not asking for that, twofold. One, as I already mentioned, we need to give teachers raises. The second reason is because of the complexity of the effective tax rate. Now, the one thing I noted from Mr. Husfeld was that it was his hunch that it's going to be a 1-for-1, and that kind of, what does that his hunch mean? So let's just imagine the worst case scenario. It's a 1-for-1 swap. What would that mean? That would mean you'd lose. In our case, we're asking for roughly $1,500 decrease in M&O, so that means next year you get $1,500,000. You get $1,500,000 less from the state, but that's assuming a big thing that he's correct. And he didn't even say that was the case. He said it could be the case, and I think that's important. And I'm sad to think that on the last night we're here voting on the budget, we don't know the answer to that. But even if it was the case, what would the budget look like if that happened? If you gave a 2 cent right now, then the worst case scenario then you'd actually lose, combined both locally and state, $1.5 million. You still would have you would still have $5.6 million more this coming budget cycle than you did last cycle. And there's no way you can convince me that that can't be used to hire more staff and give very significant raises to teachers. And I just don't know why you can't do that. And I'll just close, and I was hoping that after the last bond got defeated by 71%, a $72 million bond with $240 per square foot construction costs, that the school board would wait, just because we need a new middle school, and I'm one of the first ones to admit it. And I was hoping they were going to come back the next year and have a more reasonable bond, like 50 or 60 million, and build a middle school. But instead, they chose to go almost 150 million. And so that's a whole other issue. I'm not even going to get into that tonight. But I will say that because of that high price tag, I'm going to oppose, and our group is going to oppose the bond because we think it's too expensive. We believe we need a new middle school. We support a bond for a new middle school, but not $150 million for all the stuff that's in there. I think that stuff is needed, but down the road. But the reason I'm bringing up the bond, and the only reason I'm bringing up the bond, is because it's if you were to give some kind of M&O tax rate reduction on top of what the state's doing, that would be an incredible gesture to the taxpayers in AISD. That I met many of them 2 years ago, that the main reason they voted against the bond was not even about the details about the bond, was the fact that they're just getting killed in their property taxes. And there, many of them, up to 10%, told me voluntarily they were going to have to move because of their property taxes. And if you were to show some kind of, whether you want to call it throw a bone to them, give them a little bit of a rate reduction, I think that would go a long way in helping pass the bond. Now, I haven't said that. I mean, that's going to make it more difficult for me to try to defeat the bond. So I'm wearing two hats here, but I think that this is something that I think would be a wise move. And so I'm just going to close with this. I just simply want to ask the school board, because it's your decision, because one thing I've seen that happens here is that I feel like they come in and they say, this is the budget, yes or no, and y'all are kind of forced simply to rubber stamp. And I'm very concerned that you were, just like what happened 2 years ago, where I had a suggestion, and Mr. Husfield, he's a very smart, very nice man, but what I'm concerned about is that he threw in another clouded doubt, that because of all this uncertainty, and on a side note, if there was a lot of uncertainty, why are we giving such huge raises to staff and teachers and everything if we don't know what's going to happen? And so I'm simply asking, just keep this in mind. We have a 14% increase in M&O revenue, and I don't see why giving a 2 or 4 cent reduction in the tax rate, when you're at the very least, you could end up with still $5.5 million more, and you can do a lot with that money. And that's, I don't know whether Mr. Husfeld, I asked if he maybe could have a budget that actually presented that. What kind of salary increases could you do with a 4 cent reduction? But I was just hoping that you would have that opportunity to vote on something like that tonight. And I will close with that. Thank you for everything y'all do.
Thank you, Mr. Olcott.
Thank you.